Hello everybody, it's Tom and Dan here from Janus Film Review.
Hello.
We are very pleased to be back with a brand new podcast. We had the fortune of going to London, to the BFI South Bank.
Well, fortune's a strong word.
Fortune is a strong word.
We were in London for what was a very pleasant trip to a very nice venue, the BFI South Bank, which has got a certain heritage, a certain panache. Not lead of panache, sadly, but panache all the same.
We were there because it was a preview showing of Terry Gilliam's long gestating film, The Man Who
Speaking of understatements.
Yes, the Man Who Killed Don Quixote. We'll go into more detail about why it's been so long gestated in perhaps a moment.
Yes, indeed.
But it was also notable because the man himself was there.
Yes, he was.
And provided a very entertaining question and answer session post viewing of the film. So we kind of just wanted to talk a little bit about that, talk about the day itself, talk about the event.
Yeah, it's a broader look at what was obviously primarily about seeing this interesting film, but it was also obviously a bit of an interesting day, as Tom has noted, in terms of actually getting to sit in the same room with Terry Gilliam and listen to him primarily discuss the various challenges and issues revolving around the making of the film. He spoke about one or two other things, but primarily the talk was structured logically around The Man Who Killed Don Quixote. So
yeah, it's a film that has been, in development hell, let's say.
Well, it's come to define development hell.
It has for Terry Gilliam said at least 30 years from the initial idea of doing it to its actual release. And the interesting thing is that actually its release has sort of been very staggered over the last couple of years.
Yes.
I think it was 2017 that it was initially premiered. It's been all over Europe, all around the festival circuit, and has finally alighted in Britain and is due to be released towards the end of the year, which is excellent news for anyone who's been waiting for it, as I certainly have. It's been a story that I've been fascinated with ever since I saw the documentary that.
Yes, which we'll get to.
Yes.
We'll get to that presently. It's funny because going back to the whole development hell concept. The issue with the film has actually gone beyond, in many respects, the notion of development hell has actually led to many presumably adult, intellectually capable people referring to the film as actually being cursed. And the primary scope and scale of this curse has not been supernatural, it's been financial. Whenever the money is found, it comes from various sources, some more reputable than others. And Gilliam himself noted the more recent issues that the film had, which even at that 11th hour came fairly close to scuppering the film. And it was to do with a certain Portuguese producer who Gilliam wouldn't even bring himself to say the chap's name.
No.
As I understand it, I will say his name. I believe his name was Paulo Branca. And he has a formidable record in terms of the films that he's produced in Europe. But I had a quick glance at his Wikipedia page, and it reads like it was written by Joseph Goebbels. So you can take from that what you will. He clearly has a very high opinion of himself, and some of his statements that he put out during the ensuing legal troubles were quite extraordinary. I mean, it's well worth looking into. I mean, Tom was going to mention the documentary. The documentary is, of course, Lost in La Mancha, which chronicles the making of the first serious attempt to mount the film, which was back around the year 2000.
Yes, around then, about 20 years ago.
Which, as I say, is a story which is worth telling in and of itself. But the filmmakers of that particular production are actually in the process of doing a follow-up to it, which it's not been decided yet if it will be a separate production in its own right, or if it will be an extra feature when they eventually get around to releasing Don Quixote on disc or anything like that. So
I wasn't aware of that. That's good.
No, I wasn't either. But I did a little reading prior to today, and I say they are doing it. I can't remember if they said it was in post production at this point in time, but it may very well end up just being a very credible feature on the DVD or Blu-ray release. But it's an interesting thing anyway, because it's logical, because obviously the story of Don Quixote ends, fortunately, with Don Quixote, but the notion of chronicling the events, in many respects, it began with Lost in La Mancha, and Lost in La Mancha is a fascinating story in and of itself.
That's right. And Gilliam himself mentioned that actually the existence of Lost in La Mancha added a certain amount of pressure to mounting this final version, because, of course, Lost in La Mancha... It's the mythos of this film that was beyond everyone's grasp, which would assume that the film would have been any good in the first place.
Yes.
Which, of course, we would never have known in that original concept.
I think it would have been quite a bit wilder.
Yes.
And maybe a tiny bit more adventurous had it been made in that initial incarnation. I'm not sure how well it would have aged, given that time. I think that it would have wanted for a certain subtlety. The finished product has a certain low-key quality to it, where Gilliam himself again stressed the fact that the manner in which the film needed to be made, in terms of money, but also in terms of how quickly they had to get it made, they decided to abandon some of the more elaborate techniques they were planning to tell the story, and the setting in terms of where it was initially going to be all set in a particular period in history. And then they were going to use a time travel mechanism, and they did away with that for the sake of budgetary constraints. So the film is all set. Gilliam said in the 20th century, there was no real evidence of setting a time. I think it's just to be accepted that it was contemporary times.
Yes, yeah. And that's interesting about the whole thing of sort of doing away with the more elaborate stuff, because obviously that's Gilliam's stock in trade. I mean, if you look back on his catalogue, things like Baron Munchausen, things like Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus, Time Bandits, all those things are very much, it is all the bells and whistles. It's everything. It's the kitchen sink, it's sets, it's elaborate costumes, it's forced perspective effects, it's all that stuff. And as you've said it's notable that actually they are notable by their absence, because it is a far more straightforward filmmaking process for Gilliam, this one, than his other previous films, I would say.
Quixote is still a wild ride, but there is almost a vague meta quality to the presentation. One almost gets the sense, and particularly in the early doors of the film, where you're not quite sure what's going on.
It's quite a slow start.
Yeah, it has a certain documentary quality to it. You almost get the sense that Gilliam might be purposefully demystifying what you expect from him. Because as Tom notes with the typical expectations of a Gilliam film, it's almost like a kaleidoscopic tapestry that you expect from Gilliam, from the type of cinema that he tends to put forward. And I mean, particularly when you look at things like Time Bandits, Baron Munchausen, and again, Dr. Parnassus, those are all good examples, which are quite wild in terms of their ambition and their aesthetic style. Whereas Don Quixote, it's almost as if it's winking at itself, and I think there is a certain validity to that.
There's some lovely moments within that where there was a few sort of knowing giggles from the audience, certain lines, certain moments where you think, this is just saying something about the process that has been through to get to this point. I mean, there's a lovely moment where one of the characters is being dragged through this story, and he says, "There's a plot." And it's kind of like, actually, if you were to sort of look at the plot of Don Quixote, it's very simple.
It is.
And it's about dreams. It's about believing yourself to be someone that you're not. It's about basically someone who's a bit lost.
On a more primal basis, it's about disconnection as well.
It is.
It's about losing yourself in the dreams of avarice, in wanting to be rich, wanting to be noteworthy in a very superficial kind of way, and certainly that is where Adam Driver's character comes into proceedings. He's somebody who has become detached from the fundamentals of life. He's a bit of a playboy. He doesn't struggle in terms of warm company at night, as it were, and he's made a few bob, and he looks quite dapper, but he's degenerated into an overwhelming cynic.
Yes.
And he doesn't seem to really have any great sense of who he is anymore.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And without, this is aiming to be spoiler-free, as we always are.
Yes, indeed.
But the idea is that Adam Driver is a filmmaker. He's made a student film of Don Quixote many years ago. He revisits that place, making a new film, and tries to find the people that were his cast, which basically were made up of the village people of, not the village people, but the village
yes,
of the town. That would be a very different film.
Yeah, this is an 80s free zone. In that regard, so.
And it goes from there. Adam Driver we've mentioned, but we both agreed, I think, yesterday that the film really belongs to Jonathan Pryce.
Yes, who
plays the eponymous Don Quixote.
Yes, this is a showcase for Jonathan Pryce where the onus is on him to carry off what is a pretty formidable challenge in terms of convincing you that he is swept away in his own delusion in the sweetest way possible, obviously.
Yes.
And he rises to the fore with panache, quite frankly. There's that lovely word again, but it's true. He's very, very affecting in the role. He's totally committed to it in every way imaginable, and you can empathise with it. You know, it's clear that something is not right. That you can't necessarily take what's being said, how he's behaving at face value, but it's extremely amusing. It's very, very tender. It is a committed, full bore performance from Jonathan Pryce.
Absolutely. And interestingly, in its first incarnation, it was Jean Rochefort who sadly became ill. That was one of the many things that befell the film, so it couldn't be continued.
He had a literal pain in the arse.
He did, absolutely. Which, was, as I say, was one of the many factors that resulted in the film being abandoned. But then Gilliam mentioned Robert Duvall, which would have been an interesting choice, and perhaps taken the film in with a different tone, different direction, may not have been the best.
I say that sometimes these things happen for, and a byproduct of them is that it's a good thing. And I think Robert Duvall would have been dreadful in that role. You look at the essential eccentricity and the kind of twinkle that Don Quixote has to have, and I don't personally, I don't see Robert Duvall bringing that to the page. I think it would have been pretty poor had he done it. The other name that was perpetually linked with it, right up until they actually went ahead and did it in the end, was Michael Palin.
Yes.
And there's another name that we need to touch on as well, which was when they were actually going to go out and shoot it, it was going to be John Hurt.
Yeah.
And I think that Gilliam was very enthusiastic about John Hurt taking on the role, because I think with Duvall, I think that was probably a bit of Hollywood stunt casting. And with Michael Palin, I don't think that Gilliam was ever truly convinced that Palin was the right choice, but he has cachet, and obviously it's two fellow Pythons and all that, and it has a certain use to it. But when he got John Hurt, old craggy face himself, I think he was very enthusiastic. I think he felt he found the person who could embody Don Quixote. And he was all set to go. And then, of course, sadly, John Hurt was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, which would ultimately claim him. And he tried to carry on working, but circumstances such as they were, coupled with these issues that financial issues which afflicted the production, it just wasn't meant to be. And I mean, I would have loved to have seen John Hurt in that role.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. He would have absolutely captured it spot on. But the other amusing part of the story is, of course, is that Gilliam sort of makes much of the fact that Jonathan Pryce was almost like hammering on the door saying, hey, excuse me, what about me? Can I play this role, please? But at various junctures he felt he was too young, or he felt that he wasn't the right person for the role. But ultimately, it worked in his favour, and a 70-year-old Jonathan Pryce turns out to be the ideal casting.
Well, they say patience is a virtue, and for Jonathan Pryce, I mean, I got the impression, and I'm sure this is true, that Gilliam was embellishing that story for the audience's music, because it was very funny. But there is no doubt that Jonathan Pryce hasn't had a particularly interesting vehicle for him and him alone. I mean, he impressed everybody with his portrayal of the High Sparrow in Game of Thrones, but that was very much a supporting role, a fairly minor role, albeit an impactful one. So it's nice to see someone of Jonathan Pryce's ability and history being in that position again, and particularly, I suppose, with Gilliam, when one takes into account Brazil. And Gilliam, as much as he was almost lampooning, as we've just said, the notion of Pryce wanting the role for years and years and years, he did go on to say that when you see him, and obviously when you see the finished film, you can't imagine anybody else playing Don Quixote, and I think there is some truth to that.
Absolutely.
As much as I've said I would have liked to have seen John Hurt do it, I'm not sure that his performance would have been any better than what we get from Jonathan Pryce. He is the best thing in the film. You know, it's a shame really, because the rather tortured nature of the film's existence, even up to the very end, will likely preclude any proper awards acknowledgement, particularly something along the lines of the Academy Awards. But it's a performance which I think, let's just say, I've seen much less merited awards and nominations given for performances like that. And I think that he does deserve to be in the running to be considered for it, but I don't see it happening.
No. Well, perhaps not. Perhaps not. It's interesting because I've never been a huge fan of Jonathan Pryce. Certain things I've seen him in, I think, you know, a few years ago he could be a little bit inconsistent, but also miscast in certain things.
Yeah,
I think that's maybe coloured my opinion of him. But actually, when you see him in this film, you think, yeah, that is absolutely spot on, and I agree with you to do with the awards recognition. So we will see, but obviously,
I think age suits certain performance.
That's right, yeah.
And I think that Jonathan Pryce has found a slightly altered voice, and he seems to suit the kind of wizened disposition that he possesses now. And as I say, he works fantastically within the body of this film. And without such a strong performance to anchor the whole thing, it wouldn't have worked probably at all, but certainly nowhere near as well as it has done.
Because ultimately, it is a rather glorious mess.
Yes, that's not a bad way of looking at it.
I think you could level that at a few of Gilliam's films. I think his creative scope often outstrips the final product. You commented yesterday that you don't think he's really ever made a bad film.
No.
It's just he's made some absolute great films, masterpieces, and some things that would not fall into that category but are by no means bad. They just do not quite reach the level that Gilliam was hoping for artistically.
I think Gilliam always shoots for the stars.
Yeah.
And it's no shame if you do that, if your ambition is essentially limitless and you don't quite live up to it.
Yes.
And I think with a lot of Gilliam's films in the more latter years, the scale of the idea, the desire to reach a certain level with the fundamental idea, he hasn't quite pulled it off for one reason or another. And when you're talking about a filmmaker who, from sort of the beginning with Time Bandits all the way up to Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, 12 Monkeys, he had this glorious period where everything he put out was completely realising the scope of its own ambition, was causing people to pay attention to it.
Yes.
It was receiving awards buzz, obviously, with The Fisher King and with Robin Williams. There was a palpable anticipation, and I think it's interesting because obviously we were saying about what the film might have been like, and that's obviously what the documentary Lust in La Mancha chronicles.
It does.
That would have come, had it been made when it was supposed to be, that would have come at the tail end of that period. So, you know, I think it would have been a very different beast.
It would.
If it had been made when it was supposed to be made.
And of course, Johnny Depp was originally cast in the Adam Driver role, which, you know, again, it was a peak period for him as well. He'd previously worked on Fear and Loathing as well, so, you know, there was that sort of connection.
But I think going back to as I say, where Gilliam is at this stage, I just think he's always been one of Hollywood's foremost enfant terrible. There's always been that sense that he doesn't really give a shit, frankly, about the typical studio politics that define Hollywood, and has always been rather frustrated. And that was something that came across again, listening to the man talk about it. He didn't need much of an invitation to segue into stating his avowed conviction that art is art and that the money men simply don't get it. And I don't think you can dispute that. I mean, that is a cliche as old as time itself. But with the finished film, The Man Who Killed Don Quixote, there is a sense that it's not quite even. The early doors, the early part of the film, it feels a bit dissociated. You're not really sure what he's trying to say, where he's going. I mean, there's some very amusing barbs. I mean, the film essentially begins on a rather low-key shoot with obviously Adam Driver's character there and the various people around him, the acolytes, the sycophants. And one gets the sense that it's interesting, but there are a lot of barbs being fired at the people who have vexed Gilliam over the
Yes.
course of this. There's the producer there who's a whinging weasel. There's various other people there who just they're not fleshed out. It doesn't really matter who they're not even named.
No.
I mean, that leads me on to a point that kind of annoyed me a little bit. So the film's got Stellan Skarsgård in it, and obviously Stellan Skarsgård is a magnificent actor who has worked with Lars von Trier, with Nymphomaniac. He was recently a part of the Chernobyl miniseries for Sky Atlantic, which was absolutely incredible, and his performance within that is brilliant. And you realise you have an actor on your hands who can really go to places that others are not prepared to go. There's no reason for him to be there. He's not doing anything, and his character
Very much wasted.
Yeah, his character doesn't even have a name. Quite a few of the characters within. I mean, that's not unusual for Gilliam either, for where characters have titles or mononyms rather than actual fully fleshed names.
Well, he is credited as the boss.
Yes, and that's what I was going to say. That character is simply called the boss. And I say one of the exceptions, obviously, is that Adam Driver's character does actually have a name. Obviously, that's Toby, and that's quite a stereotypical American name. Which I say again, it plays into this idea that this is a character who came from quite earnest and legitimate background and has lost his way.
Yeah. Speaking of the rest of the cast as well, I mean, we've mentioned Skarsgård, we've mentioned Driver, we've mentioned Jonathan Pryce. But there are some lovely supporting roles. Joanna Ribeiro plays Angelica, or Angelica as Toby likes to call her,
Yes.
who was a young girl he cast in his original Don Quixote film, and is one of the people that he goes searching for once he revisits the village.
There's kind of a duality to her role within the film, because she's supposed to represent the embodiment of innocence for Don Quixote within the narrative of his own little mind, as it were. She is also an innocent. She represents essentially the same thing for Toby.
Yes.
So that it serves a dual purpose.
It does, and there's a lovely scene where he eventually does find her, and realises that perhaps her current life situation is not as she would want it and not as he would want it for her, which is, that was another thing that I noticed about the film, or I felt about the film, was it was actually very touching in places and very moving, and the emotions hit the spot, which again is something that doesn't always happen in a Gilliam film.
No, they can be too esoteric sometimes.
That's right.
They lose themselves again in the theme and in the ambition, and sometimes you have to rely on the skill of the performer, and in this instance I don't think it's entirely dissimilar here. I think that the fundamental truth of the story, which we can't elaborate on too much because it would verge perilously close to a spoiler, in terms of the journey of the Don, I think the issue here is that you rely on the ability of the actor to convey those feelings. And I think that is very much the case with Jonathan Pryce. This is why his performance is as good as it is, because you can empathise with a character who could be objectively described as a lunatic. And you do so willingly and with great affection. And that is, in some respects, the ultimate affirmation of Jonathan Pryce in this role.
No, and you root for him, and that's the important thing.
Yeah,
Despite the humiliation that he might go through at certain points, or the just, as you say, that sort of complete distance from reality, you kind of go, but I really want this guy to succeed.
Yeah.
I really want him to.
I mean, you don't even know precisely what it is he wants to succeed
No,
at.
that's right.
I mean, that's the true test of empathy, I suppose, is that you don't necessarily understand it yourself, yet you still find yourself thinking, "Oh well, I'd like him to win.
Yes,
I'd like him to do well."
Absolutely.
And you do. But as I said to you, it's unquestionably Jonathan Pryce's film. I mean, Adam Driver deserves some credit for playing the role manfully. I mean, Toby is a difficult character because there's a lot about him which is fundamentally unlikable.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
But he plays a character who is essentially plunged into this quite extraordinary, very typically Gilliam spectacle in terms of the real and the unreal. And he does a very, very good job with it. I'm not sure if he was necessarily the perfect choice for the role. I mean, obviously, the only thing we can really do is kind of juxtapose him hypothetically with the people who have been linked with the role. I mean, Johnny Depp being the most noteworthy one.
Ewan McGregor as well.
Oh yeah, I would not have liked Ewan McGregor in the role, I have to say. I was thinking actually, I would have quite liked to have seen James McAvoy in the role. I think that he's got a certain chameleon quality which I'm not sure Adam Driver has. I mean, we were talking about this when we were heading back, and really, Adam Driver is Adam Driver in almost every film he plays, and it's kind of similar with this. It's an effective performance. He's obviously, it's well written, so you laugh when you're supposed to in that regard. You're never laughing at him. No. But there's just something not quite there. But it works. I mean, the chemistry between him and the Don is sufficient.
It is.
It's not fire crackling trumpets from heaven kind of a connection, but it is effective. I mean, in terms of the rest of the cast, beyond those we've already mentioned, Olga Kurilenko's in it, and she doesn't actually have much to do yet. That's actually quite a challenge for her sometimes, I think, and she does it rather well.
The boss's wife, as she's
referred
to many times.
The boss, and then you have the boss's wife, and as that whole designation is intended to connote, she is quite the fire-breathing slut. So.
We also have a somewhat surprising appearance, but not in other ways, of Jason Watkins.
Yeah,
playing Jason Watkins. He seems to be another actor who's very good at that. He's had this sort of period of being denoted as some kind of comedy god in most of the things he's been in. I still remember him as Mr. Shakespeare in the Nativity series. I think that's a high watermark for him. But yeah, Rupert, who's sort of the sycophantic, part of Toby's filmmaking team. He's the guy that rubs his shoulders. He's the guy that is always giving him the sort of positive feedback and.
His main, as I said to you, he is a comprehensive little weasel, and his main purpose is basically to provide the exclamation point to Toby's journey by, frankly, being twatted in the face, which he does very well. I mean, he's well set. He's got a very punchable face anyway, I think, so that works rather well. In terms of our overall feeling of the film, we both agreed that it takes a little while to get going. It seems a bit muddled in the early stages. It's tonally inconsistent. You kind of dive back and forth between sequences, and it doesn't really work. It takes a while to coalesce.
Yes.
But once it finds itself, by concentrating on the central journey, which obviously it revolves around Don Quixote, once it settles itself down into that, it becomes a frankly barking mad kind of road trip. And it finds itself, it becomes pure Gilliam. It's very sharp, very witty, very strange. And it does work.
It does.
And you it's endearing. You find yourself invested in the characters. It's never less than entertaining. I think that the troubled nature, to put it mildly, of the journey that it undertook to get to even coming into being, it's almost like a scar that's writ large over the whole film. I think the amount of times that the script's been rewritten, I mean, Gilliam, when we were listening to him, joked about that they would rewrite the script twice every single year prior to making it. So there's a lot that's fairly fresh, and there are one or two things that have been in there since time immemorial. But it does kind of feel like it's a bit of a tapestry. Sometimes it's been sort of woven together. It's a bit of a patchwork. It's been woven together. There's different things that work, some things that don't. Gilliam acknowledges he's cherry-picked scenes from different scripts that he's liked, kept them there, tried to make them work, tried to get them together. And it works more often than not. And I actually think that the more low-key take on the story benefits the film. I think that if it had been something akin to Time Bandits with all the time travelling and all the other bits and pieces, it would have been closer to what people expect from a Gilliam film, but I don't think it would have been such a good film.
Yeah. I think, yes, I agree. That first sort of half hour, 40 minutes is just, you're really setting its stall. You're trying to work out who everybody is. You mentioned about Adam Driver's character not being particularly likeable, and I was sat there thinking, if this is what he's going to be like for the rest of the film, it doesn't bode well. However, once his connection with Quixote comes in, and as you say, the road trip aspect sets in, I found it very involving. I found it, the jokes started working.
Yeah.
And the, as you say, that connection with the characters started working. And you just brought along, dragged in its wake, smiling and giggling and just going, actually, yeah, I'm enjoying myself. It's, and I think that's the aim of a Gilliam film, isn't it?
Yeah.
He wants you just to enjoy yourself and just be taken into a complete unreality for a couple of hours. But there are some lovely Python touches.
Yeah.
I was thinking of things like, definitely women with beards. That's a common Python touch.
Yeah.
We've got lots of sheep jokes.
Yeah, including one which is absolutely magnificent. I mean, if you don't find that funny, I suggest you immediately check your pulse.
Yes.
Because it doesn't matter whether you like the Python humour or not, or any other type of humour. That is so funny. And as I said, you know
it when you see it. It's
and
jokes.
I say as a writer, as a director, as an artist, you know you're onto something when you're bold enough to actually include a reference to a reference essentially within your own film.
Yeah.
He actually acknowledges a joke in his own film.
Yes.
So you must be pretty confident, and with good reason, because that is absolutely hilarious. And full marks to Adam Driver for playing that with all its worth.
Oh, absolutely. 100% into that.
Yeah. We have to say something in terms of obviously having sat and listened to Gilliam. I think that the man comes across as representative of his own work. He doesn't pull any punches and he doesn't give a shit. I think he knows that people will watch his films and will be entirely befuddled by them, but they are his films. His lifelong frustration with the way the Hollywood machine moves, works, operates is clear as day, but he is very, very charming in an inimitable fashion, and he's very, very likeable.
He is, yeah.
You don't feel like you are listening to a wind-up toy or a robot who's just been sat down. I mean, he came onto stage with a quite nice-looking red, and he was wearing what we eventually decided was a kimono over a t-shirt and jeans or whatever it was. Yeah, he was. He wears his eccentricity on his sleeve.
He certainly does.
And the Q&A session was about half an hour, 45 minutes, something like that, and it flew by. And he's a credit to his own work. He's quite the potty mouth. I can appreciate that. It was fun listening to him. Could have listened to him quite a bit longer. He tells the twisted narrative of this film very, very well. So as I said to you, it was very, very fun. It was a very unique way to appreciate a motion picture, which in itself is arguably the embodiment of unique. Not just obviously the film itself, but the journey that it has been on to arrive on the screen in the end.
And I suppose in conclusion, a question that went through my mind, which someone asked in the auditorium, was, what next?
Yeah.
And we were discussing that idea that, the phrase you used was, what happens when you found your El Dorado?
Yeah, you spend your whole life searching for your pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, your El Dorado. And most people don't get that, yet Gilliam has found El Dorado. For so many years, the quest for Don Quixote has defined him. It's always been he's completed a particular film, and then somebody will cheekily say to him, "What about Don Quixote?" And you can't do that anymore because he's done it. The film exists in some form or another. So for Terry Gilliam, where do you go from here? I'm sure that he has other ideas, and that he will head to the various places that he wants to go. But it is interesting because it's the struggle, supposedly, that gives life meaning. And now that Gilliam has made Don Quixote, one can't help wondering where exactly he's going to go from here.
But it certainly sounds like he deserves a good rest.
Yes, I think I said to you, have another couple of glasses of that red. In fact, have the whole bottle, maybe another one on top. Just sit down and have a relax. I mean, he's achieved it. He's done it. It's very, very good. And the film that has come out of it is by no means what he wanted it to be, certainly as it was originally conceived, but it is a good film. I found it to be very relatable, very likable. It covers all the necessary Gilliam themes in terms of being a bit anti-establishment, considering the various sort of existential meanings of life. There's some fantastic cutting shots at organised religion, as you would expect, not just from Gilliam, but from any Python in many respects. There are things in it which you expect. It is a Gilliam film.
Through and through.
But on a lower key, and I kind of like that.
Thank you for listening. We hope you've enjoyed what you've had to hear, and do check it out when it comes out later in the year. I think it's being distributed by Sparky Films, I believe.
Yes, and the producer was actually sat in the audience with us, and Gilliam made sure that we gave him a hearty hand.
A hearty hand.
I think he deserves it.
Absolutely. We have other podcasts available for your delectation. We have Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. We have Fighting with My Family. We have one about previews of films that we're looking forward to. And there is more coming. So
We can't guarantee that you will always enjoy the content, but we do pledge to always try and be interesting.
Exactly, and I hope we have been. Take care and see you again.
Bye bye now.